Trump's trade fight with Canada could hit your prices, your job market, and your energy costs faster than most people think. Washington tried to use tariffs as pressure, but Canada under Mark Carney is trying to turn that pressure back into American political pain. The public story looks like a tariff dispute, but the deeper story is whether Canada has quietly built a defense machine that makes bullying Ottawa more expensive than Washington expected. And the proof is not in one loud speech. It is in the timing, the sectors, the money, and the pressure points now appearing on both sides of the border. The headline sounds dramatic. Trump declared economic war, and Carney's hidden machine crushed it in 72 hours. Now, we have to be careful. There is no solid public evidence that the United States launched some secret total six-front embargo against every part of the Canadian economy. There is no confirmed evidence of a full financial blockade, a total mineral cutoff, a diplomatic downgrade, or a frozen investment wall around Canada. But here is what is real. The United States has placed serious tariff pressure on key Canadian sectors: steel, aluminum, autos, lumber, copper. These are not small side industries. These are the bones of the North American economy. These are the products that move through factories, ports, rail lines, construction sites, auto plants, military supply chains, and family paychecks. Canada has kept counter tariffs in place on steel, aluminum, and automobiles, while negotiations continue according to Canada's own finance department. Canada also removed broader counter tariffs on many U.S. goods in September 2025, but kept the fight alive in those core sectors because the U.S. tariffs remained. That detail matters. Because this is not just Canada swinging wildly in every direction. This is Canada narrowing the battlefield. And that is where Carney's strategy begins to look less like ordinary retaliation and more like a prepared system. Trump's basic approach is not hard to understand. He believes tariffs create leverage. He believes the U.S. market is so large that other countries will bend before American consumers feel the pain. He believes Canada needs access to the United States more than the United States needs access to Canada. There is some truth in the first part. Canada is deeply tied to the U.S. economy. A huge share of Canadian exports move south. Canadian factories are wired into American demand. Canadian energy feeds American industry. Canadian minerals matter to American defense, batteries, electronics, and advanced manufacturing. But that same integration cuts both ways. A tariff on Canada is not like a tariff on a distant country shipping finished goods across an ocean. A tariff on Canada hits a shared production system. It can hit parts that cross the border more than once. It can hit a car before it is finished. It can hit steel before it becomes a machine. It can hit aluminum before it becomes a vehicle, an aircraft part, or a consumer product. That is the trap inside Trump's pressure campaign. The more Washington attacks Canada, the more Washington risks attacking its own supply chain. And Carney appears to understand that better than most politicians. He is not behaving like a leader who thinks the answer is just to shout louder. He is behaving like someone who sees the entire board: finance, trade law, industrial support, energy security, critical minerals, allied coordination, domestic politics inside the United States. That is the hidden machine in this story. Not a secret button, not a magic 72-hour weapon. A structure, a system of pressure points that Canada can activate when Washington pushes too far. The first part of that machine is industrial support. On May 4th, Canada announced a $1 billion Canadian loan program for industries hit by U.S. tariffs. The program targets businesses that manufacture and export products containing steel, aluminum, or copper. Reuters reported that the Business Development Bank of Canada will provide loans between $2 million and $5 million Canadian dollars on favorable terms. And Ottawa also announced another $500 million Canadian dollars for regional development agencies to support tariff-hit sectors. That may sound boring compared with the phrase economic war, but it is not boring if you own a factory. It is not boring if your town depends on steel. It is not boring if your workers are trying to survive a trade fight they did not start. This is how a government tells Washington, you may try to hurt our producers, but we are going to keep them alive long enough to outlast your pressure. That is not a social media response. That is an economic defense wall. And it has a second purpose. It tells Canadian industry not to panic. It tells investors that Ottawa is not going to let strategic sectors collapse. It tells workers that the government understands the fight is not theoretical. It is about wages, shifts, contracts, and whether companies can keep operating while politicians negotiate. The second part of the machine is targeted retaliation. Canada could try to hit everything. That would be loud. It would also be risky. Instead, Ottawa's official approach has been more focused. Canada says counter tariffs remain on steel, aluminum, and automobiles because the U.S. still maintains tariffs in those sectors without an exemption for CUSMA-compliant goods. That is a very important phrase, CUSMA-compliant goods. In the United States, people call it USMCA. In Canada, people call it CUPAS. Same trade deal, same North American supply chain, same basic promise. If products follow the rules, they should move across the region with special treatment. So when Canada frames the issue around CUSMA compliance, it is not just complaining about tariffs. It is saying Washington is damaging the very agreement that was supposed to protect North America's industrial base. That is where the American audience needs to pay attention. Because if this trade fight breaks the North American system, the damage does not stop at the Canadian border. American auto companies know this. Major auto trade groups recently urged the Trump administration to extend the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, saying it is crucial for U.S. vehicle production at a time when North America faces competition from Asia and Europe. Reuters reported that 7 groups representing automakers, car dealers, and parts makers warned that splitting USMCA into separate deals would add complexity, burden companies, and weaken the supply chains the agreement was built to protect. That is not Canada saying it, that is industry saying it, and that is the blowback Carney can count on. If Trump pressures Canada too hard, Canadian officials do not need to convince every American voter. They only need enough U.S. businesses, governors, senators, farmers, energy buyers, and manufacturers to realize the pain is coming back home. That is the real counterattack, not one dramatic strike. Pressure inside America. This is where Trump's style can become a weakness. He likes the image of dominance. He likes the simple story. America applies pressure. Smaller countries give in. But Canada is not simply a smaller country standing alone with no cards. Canada is the biggest foreign supplier of many resources that the United States needs, and it sits directly inside the North American production machine. So Carney does not have to beat Trump in a shouting match. He has to make the cost of Trump's strategy visible to Americans. This situation is moving fast. By the time mainstream coverage catches the full picture, the moment to understand it may already have passed. Subscribe so you are ahead of the story, not catching up to it. Now, the third part of Carney's machine is diversification. This is the part that should worry Washington the most. Carney has said the tariffs show Canada needs to reduce its heavy reliance on the U.S. market. Reuters reported that he said Canada is not a supplicant and will not let the United States dictate the terms of the USMCA review. That is not just tough language, that is a strategic warning. For decades, the basic assumption in North America was simple. Canada sells south, America buys north. And the two economies stay tightly connected because the arrangement benefits both sides. Trump's tariff strategy challenges that assumption. It tells Canada that access to the U.S. market can be turned into a weapon. Carney's answer is not to shut the door overnight. His answer is to ask a harder question. Why should Canada keep making itself vulnerable to one buyer if that buyer keeps using vulnerability as leverage? That is where the hidden machine becomes bigger than tariffs. Canada does not have to cut off energy to change the balance. It can slow deeper integration. It can search for new buyers. It can build export infrastructure. It can strengthen ties with Europe, Japan, South Korea, India, and other partners. It can use critical minerals as a long-term strategic asset instead of a cheap bargaining chip. And this is important. Carney has publicly rejected the idea that Canada will use energy or critical minerals as leverage by halting trade. Canadian press reporting carried by Construct Connect said he ruled out stopping that trade and said Canadians honor contracts and agreements. But he also questioned whether deeper integration with the United States still makes sense if Washington treats that integration as leverage. That is the elegant part of the strategy. Canada is not saying we will break our contracts. Canada is saying we may not sign away the next layer of dependence. That is a much more serious message. Because contracts today are one thing, future integration is another. New pipelines, new mineral agreements, new processing deals, new joint ventures, new defense supply chains, new energy corridors. Those are choices. Canada can choose whether deeper dependence on the United States is still smart. And if Washington wants Canadian energy and minerals to reduce dependence on China, then Canada's bargaining power rises. This is why the competitor version of the story gets one thing emotionally right, even if many of its details are exaggerated. The real issue is not whether Canada launched some cartoon-style secret counterattack in 72 hours. The real issue is that Carney seems to be treating the trade fight like a systems problem, while Trump is treating it like a force problem. Trump is asking, how hard can we hit? Carney is asking, where does the pain travel after the hit lands? That difference matters. The fourth part of the machine is allied coordination. Critical minerals are now a global power issue. They are needed for electric vehicles, wind turbines, electronics, batteries, and defense systems. At a recent G7 trade ministers meeting in Paris, critical minerals and supply chain security became a major focus, with G7 ministers saying they wanted attempts to weaponize economic dependencies to fail. Reuters also reported that China's dominant position in these mineral markets remains a key concern for G7 governments. That gives Canada room to maneuver. Canada is not just negotiating as a tariff victim. Canada is negotiating as a resource power inside a world that is desperate for secure supply chains. That is why the seven-nation coalition claim from the competitor story should be treated carefully. There is no confirmed public evidence of an automatic seven-country economic defense pact that instantly activates against the United States. But there is a real G7 push around critical minerals, supply chain security, and reducing dependence on China. And Canada can use that environment, not by screaming, by positioning. If the U.S. becomes unpredictable, allies look for redundancy. If China dominates critical minerals, allies look for trusted suppliers. If tariffs make North America unstable, companies look for safer routes. Canada can present itself as the stable democratic supplier that honors contracts while still protecting its sovereignty. That is the Carney lane, not chaos, credibility. And credibility can become a weapon when the other side is creating uncertainty. The fifth part of the machine is time. The USMCA review is not some distant technical event. It is here. Reported that the three countries face a July 1st review deadline, with the possibility that the agreement gets renewed, changed, or moved into a more uncertain process. That deadline changes the entire trade fight. Because Trump's tariffs are not just about today's pressure. They shape the negotiating environment for the next version of North American trade. If Canada enters those talks looking weak, Washington can demand more. If Canada enters those talks with industry support, targeted countermeasures, allied options, and American business groups warning against disruption, the power balance changes. That is why 72 hours matters as a symbol, even if we should not treat it as a verified military-style timeline. The point is speed. Carney cannot wait 6 months to look organized. He has to show immediately that Canada has a plan, that companies have support, that the public should not panic, and that Washington will not get a clean win. And that is exactly what makes this story bigger than one tariff announcement. Trump's bet is that pressure creates surrender. Carney's bet is that pressure creates unity, diversification, and domestic blowback inside the United States. One side wants fear, the other side wants time. Now ask yourself this. Is Canada being too cautious by refusing to openly weaponize energy and critical minerals? Or is Carney playing a smarter long game by keeping contracts intact while making future access conditional? That question is going to divide people. Some Canadians want immediate retaliation. They want energy used as a weapon. They want minerals used as a weapon. They want Washington to feel pain quickly because they believe Trump only respects force. That frustration is understandable. If your country is being tariffed, insulted, pressured, and treated like a subordinate, patience can look like weakness. But there is a counter-argument. If Canada cuts off supplies or tears up contracts, it could damage its own reputation as a reliable supplier. It could frighten allies. It could hand Washington a public excuse to escalate. It could hurt Canadian workers in the very industries Canada is trying to defend. Carney's approach appears to be different. Do not break contracts, do not panic, do not overplay the hand, but also do not deepen dependence for free. That is a colder strategy, less emotional, less satisfying in the short term, but potentially more dangerous to Washington over time, because it tells the U.S. that Canada's cooperation is not automatic anymore. And that is a major shift. For American viewers, this matters because tariffs are not paid by foreign leaders in some clean, distant way. They move through importers, manufacturers, retailers, supply chains, and eventually consumers. Sometimes companies absorb part of the cost. Sometimes they pass it on. Sometimes they cut production. Sometimes they delay hiring. Sometimes they move sourcing. But the cost does not disappear. So when Trump says tariffs make America stronger, the question is, stronger for whom? If tariffs protect one factory but raise costs for 10 others, that is not a simple win. If tariffs pressure Canada but make U.S. automakers less competitive against Asia and Europe, that is not a clean victory. If tariffs push Canada to build new markets outside the United States, that may feel strong today but weaken American influence tomorrow. That is the danger of overconfidence. A tariff can be a tool, but when every tool becomes a weapon, allies start building shields. For Canadian viewers, the stakes are even more personal. This is about whether Canada remains trapped in a relationship where the U.S. market is both opportunity and threat. It is about whether Canada can protect workers without cutting itself off from its biggest customer. It is about whether Ottawa can move from reactive politics to strategic planning. And it is about national dignity. Carney's message, stripped down to its simplest form, is this: Canada will trade with the United States, but Canada will not be treated as a supplicant. That line matters because it reframes the relationship. Canada is not trying to become anti-American. That would be economically foolish and strategically dangerous. The U.S. and Canada share geography, defense ties, energy flows, families, businesses, and one of the most important borders on Earth. But friendship is not the same as dependence, and partnership is not the same as obedience. That is the distinction Carney is trying to make. The global impact is also serious. Every ally is watching how Washington treats Canada. If the United States can pressure Canada this way, what does that tell Europe? What does it tell Japan? What does it tell South Korea? What does it tell smaller allies who depend on U.S. security guarantees and U.S. markets? And what does it tell China? Beijing does not need to defeat the Western Alliance if the Western Alliance keeps damaging itself. Every tariff fight between allies creates an opening for rivals. Every supply chain dispute inside the G7 makes it harder to build a united front on critical minerals, technology, defense, and industrial policy. This is the hidden cost of Trump's trade politics. It may create a short-term image of strength, but it can also weaken trust. And trust is not soft. Trust is infrastructure. Trust is what lets companies invest across borders. Trust is what lets militaries share supply chains. Trust is what lets countries plan together for energy security, minerals, defense production, and economic shocks. Once trust breaks, rebuilding it takes years. This is why Canada's response is so important. Carney is not just trying to win one fight. He is trying to change the price of future pressure. He wants Washington to understand that if it uses tariffs casually, Canada will not simply beg for relief. Canada will support industries, keep targeted countermeasures, seek other markets, question deeper integration, and coordinate with allies. That is the machine. It is not dramatic because of one secret move. It is dramatic because it is layered. Industry support keeps companies alive. Counter tariffs keep pressure on politically sensitive sectors. CUSMA language keeps the fight grounded in rules. Diversification reduces future vulnerability. Critical minerals and energy create strategic bargaining power without breaking contracts. Allied coordination gives Canada options beyond Washington. And American business backlash turns Trump's pressure inward. That is how a smaller country survives a larger neighbor's pressure campaign. Not by pretending size does not matter, by making size expensive to use. Now there are limits. Canada cannot simply replace the U.S. market overnight. No serious person should pretend it can. Geography matters. Infrastructure matters. Existing contracts matter. The U.S. remains Canada's most important trading partner. If the trade war deepens, Canadian workers will feel pain first in many sectors. Carney's machine does not make Canada invincible. It makes Canada harder to break. That is the difference. And on the U.S. side, Trump still has real leverage. The American consumer market is enormous. The U.S. dollar remains central to global finance. American law can move markets. American tariffs can force companies to recalculate fast. Washington can create uncertainty simply by threatening action. But power is not the same as control. And this is where Trump may be misreading the moment. Because the more he uses American access as a weapon, the more every other country begins asking how to reduce exposure to that weapon. That includes Canada. It also includes allies who may not say it loudly in public. This is how economic power can slowly turn against itself. Use it carefully and it creates influence. Use it recklessly and it creates resistance. The competitor story turns this into a clean movie plot. Trump attacks, Carney waits. The hidden machine activates. America gets crushed in 72 hours. The real story is less clean, but in some ways more important. Trump's tariff pressure is real. Canada's targeted response is real. The industrial support is real. The USMCA deadline is real. The concern from auto groups is real. The critical mineral diplomacy is real. Carney's refusal to call energy and minerals leverage while still questioning deeper integration is real. The unsupported claims should stay unsupported, but the strategic pattern is visible. Canada is not responding like a country with no plan. It is responding like a country trying to turn a crisis into a redesign. That is why this could become one of the most important North American political stories of the year. Not because Canada has already won everything, not because Trump has already lost everything, but because the old assumption has cracked. For years, many people assumed Canada would always absorb U.S. pressure because the relationship was too important to risk. Now Carney is signaling that the relationship is still important, but Canada's vulnerability must be corrected. That is a serious message, and it lands at a dangerous time. The USMCA review is approaching. American industries are nervous. Canadian sectors are under pressure. G7 countries are trying to secure minerals and supply chains. And Trump's tariff strategy is forcing allies to decide how much unpredictability they can tolerate from Washington. Most people following this story are getting the surface version. Subscribers here get the full picture, what it means, why it matters, and what is coming next. Do not settle for half the story. So what happens next? The first thing to watch is whether Washington doubles down or looks for relief. If Trump believes tariffs are working, he may push harder. He may demand more concessions in the USMCA review. He may try to split Canada and Mexico into separate tracks. He may argue that pressure is the only way to fix what he sees as unfair trade. But if American industry keeps warning that the North American production system is being damaged, the pressure shifts. Then the fight is no longer just Trump versus Carney. It becomes Trump versus the companies that depend on Canada. Trump versus the states that need Canadian inputs. Trump versus consumers who do not want higher costs. Trump versus allies who want secure supply chains without constant political shocks. That is the pressure Carney wants to create. The second thing to watch is Canada's next move on energy and minerals. Carney has ruled out using them as a blunt weapon, but he has not ruled out using future integration as a choice. That is the key difference. Canada may keep honoring existing contracts while becoming much more selective about new commitments. That could mean more talks with Europe, more outreach to Asia, more interest in processing minerals at home, more public money for strategic sectors, more insistence that any future North American integration must respect Canadian sovereignty. The third thing to watch is domestic politics inside Canada. Carney's approach requires patience. It requires voters to believe that a disciplined strategy can work better than immediate retaliation. That is not easy when people are angry. If factories suffer, if jobs are threatened, if prices rise, pressure will grow on Ottawa to hit harder. And that is where Carney's leadership will be tested. A hidden machine only works if the public believes it is actually protecting them. For Trump, the risk is different. He has built a political brand around toughness. But if tariffs start looking less like strength and more like self-harm, that brand weakens. If American companies say the policy is hurting them, if consumers feel higher costs, if states tied to manufacturing and agriculture push back, the trade fight becomes a domestic political problem. That is why Canada does not need to defeat America. Canada only needs to make Trump's strategy expensive inside America. That is the central point. Carney's machine does not crush the United States. It challenges the idea that the United States can pressure Canada without consequences. It turns a one-way threat into a two-way calculation. And that may be enough, because in trade politics, victory is not always a surrender ceremony. Sometimes victory is forcing the other side to realize the cost of escalation is higher than the value of the demand. That is where this fight now stands. Trump has tried to use tariffs as leverage. Carney has tried to convert that leverage into a warning. Canada has options. Canada has allies. Canada has strategic resources. And Canada will not deepen dependence with a partner that treats dependence like a weapon. The current tension is clear. Trump wants pressure to produce concessions. Carney wants pressure to produce a stronger, less dependent Canada. But the next question is even bigger. If Canada starts redesigning its economy away from automatic reliance on the United States, does Washington understand what it is losing before it is too late? In my next video, I am covering how Canada's energy and critical minerals could become the real battlefield in the USMCA fight, and what I found will change how you see this.